Welcome. Welcome, Carl Dennis, and welcome the rest of you on this steamy late afternoon of an evening to the Holloway Poetry Reading Series. Tonight's reader being, the main reader being Carl Dennis tonight. I'm very happy to be able to hear these poems I've been reading for a while. I want a voice to be able to put to them. Looking very much forward. Next week, April 6th, Richard Tillinghast, another former resident of UC Berkeley, will be coming into town and reading for us. And April 20th, the poet Kimiko Han will be coming from New York to read. Tonight, we will open with a graduate student poet, that sounds terrible, but a young poet, Rachel Beck. And Rachel Beck will be introduced by Lily Loofborough. Then I'll return to say a word or two about Carl Dennis, and he'll take the stage and read, and perhaps even field a question or two if you have them. Now, fielding a question is not necessarily providing an answer, you understand, but at least they can be fielded. So, Lily, I think I'll turn the stage to you. Thank you.
Hi, can you hear me? Okay, I always feel like I disappear behind these podiums. I'm just a disembodied head. I met Rachel Beck one summer afternoon when she showed up at my house with apples and cheese. And it's a testament to her attention to detail and my lack of it that I know she could still tell me the exact type of apple it was. That was, Rachel informed me, its last week in season. Some weeks later, we were walking down College Avenue when she stopped dead in her tracks. She looked around, deep in concentration. I started looking too. It turned out she had smelled something that she and her community of fellow smell experts had been looking for, something newly in bloom. And if this were about anyone else, I'd make up what it was to make this a better story. But it being Rachel Beck, I'm not going to take the risk because I know she knows exactly what it was. Anyway, she followed her nose until she found it. I mentioned trying ham-handedly to contribute something to this olfactory discussion that I loved the smell of tomatoes. And the next day she showed up with a strange little bottle and offered me a spray of her tomato-scented perfume. This is a woman who pays attention, who listens to recorded British accents in her spare time and can identify them by region, who peels fruit with the same rapt expression she wears when she's declining Latin verbs. It would be wrong to call her a foodie. She's more of a sensory sommelier. And eating and reading, therefore, with Rachel is just never neutral. Like Eve in Book 5 of Paradise Lost, who concocts a meal fit for angels on hospitable thoughts intent, what choice to choose for delicacy best, what order so contrived as not to mix tastes not well joined, inelegant, but bring taste after taste upheld with kindliest change. Rachel Beck's poetry is in this sense, and perhaps in this sense only, deeply Miltonic. She finds more joy in the homonym and within the possibilities of rhyme than Milton ever could, though. Anyway, I thought I'd talk first about how not to approach her poetry. So here's a wordle I made of all the poems she's going to read this evening. The right way requires a deep respect for exactitude and order. This is the poetry of playful precision, where time is measured in the thickness of joggers. Earnestness is performed here with a wry humor that concocts meaning out of incidental consonants, accessories and rotisseries, scratchy, matchy-matchy. This makes sense coming from the woman whose past incarnations included teacher, church secretary, law office receptionist, filing clerk, and trucking company employee. She is, in addition to all this, an MFA from Iowa and a grad student from Berkeley whose ongoing commitment to the difficult is evident from her choice of fields, medieval and 20th century literature, as far apart as it's possible to get. Her work appears in the current issue of We Are So Happy to Know Something and New Voices, the Helen Burns Poetry Anthology, as well as Calyx, Volt, Lilliput, the Wallace Stevens Journal, the St. Paul Pioneer Press, the lovely but ephemeral online journal EMIC, and a teaching, did I say that right? Yeah, okay. And a teaching anthology of poems inspired by Shakespeare. So without further ado, let's all enjoy a feast for the ears that never quite lets you eat it.
Hi. I have a colleague, Frank Cruz, who can't be here tonight because he is playing a benefit concert for the Zachary Michael Cruz Foundation, an education and pedestrian safety philanthropy. As promised, Frank, if you ever get to hear this podcast, this one is for you and your family. This poem was occasioned by a shopping trip to Target, and it's called Two Bowls. I wanted a bowl for peaches. I wanted a bowl for peaches, floating gingered in red wine. I wanted a bowl of which peaches, gingered and drunk on wine, would not be ashamed. I ignored frosted plastic, grim striped stoneware. I passed bowls barely larger than a baby's fist. In the fourth aisle, I caught my breath at cobalt. It sang under my hand, a voice fine and spare. I envisioned dinners in a city, my table clothed in wit and fresh vegetables, friends who would teach me to eat artichokes the right way. In the center, this blue jewel, peaches, an attendant ladle. I envisioned that if asked where I found this bowl, I'd lie. It came from an art auction, a trip to Italy. I have no idea it was a present. But such thin porcelain, surely it could break in a hiccup of sun, shards of deep sky. What then? Only memory, a poor vessel. I chose instead the next bowl, the color of oyster sand, ringed Wedgwood blue, heavy as my femur, simple, rather Puritan. It did not smell of fragile breath. It could survive a hard fall. Emilia in Otello has been my favorite female character in Shakespeare for as long as I've had a favorite female character in Shakespeare. And I've always thought it was a terrible, lousy deal that when she dies, she doesn't get a closing couplet. Some years ago, I wrote a series of poems, of which this is the last, to right that wrong. Epilogue for Emilia. Perchance, Iago, I will ne'er go home. My bones, by their drained limp pile, should say, home never was. A name at most, a few damp curtains in autumn. This floor, this pool of blood where cells of wavering shimmer break to drops, but I digress. Go cut your tongue with sharp-toothed will. You've webbed yourself, and in those threads I see you lie. But I have vowed a revocation, stricken from light as the new moon. I cannot weep for home. My dimming eyes see in her hair a softer shroud than all old promises. The seabirds outside wheel and call as if pierced by wind. Give me a shawl. My knotwork now undone, I, in my green candle's haze, shall stitch a winding border, the fine lace squared and scarred with love lies bleeding. I leave my kerchief and my hand, both worth the needing. No night is complete without a poem in poor taste, so I'm going to make your night complete. One word I need to define for the handful of students I see out there, and anyone else who might not be up on old divination methods. Hepatoscopy refers to the practice of using animal entrails for fortune telling. This is called disaster, single white female, late 20s, in search of minion. Could you in hat be the one? When Harry Truman sang his last farewell, "Oh, get me to the embassy by hook, by crook, by camelback," the nation grieved and mumbled in its breakfast. Wheaties men and women grabbed their snack cakes on the run. A kindergartner asked, "Will I be next?" Some called it chaos. Others crashed their discs and started over. Listen, sirs and madams, Krakatoa was about to blow its top. It really was that bad. But since then, new emergencies have come to trumpet. Hepatoscopy will show a tropical depression Paxil cannot touch. The pigeon's liver, see, has got a purple pulsing dimple. This means war. Will we see mushrooms blooming in the east? Athena's on the prowl for physics grads. Hey, you there, in the hat. If you can host a tidal wave tomorrow, you'll be set for quite a while. A round of billiards. Friend, at risk of sounding like a Jewel song, could you sing to save your soul? Such things might come in handy swimming in the flotsam. Make no bones about it, eschatology's a stinking business, wind and fire and all, but there's no room for any more of us. No, any nihilist who's worth her salt has learned to sigh in private. Outside sing, though heart may ache and bubbles make. I've had a premonition in my ventricles before. It's most unpleasant. Still, I lived. A shiver? Are you cold? Then take my coat and wear it well. It's yours now, if you will. The epigraph to the next poem comes from Robin Cosio's book, The Eyebrow. Yes, there is such a book. With the development of the cinematic close-up, the eyes and eyebrows became the most important components of the face. This is called the arch. I am Marlene Dietrich's eyebrow. On the left, the one that peeks from shadow in Der Blaue Engel. One day I woke, redone as silken lines and silver hooks. Who can explain a sudden metamorphosis devoid of pain? When dressed in my new elements of light and grain, I mapped the 30s rise and fall. I couldn't tell. I showed codes betray the code. Ironic sunshade, critics called me. One can't uproot me any longer. I am drawn in coal and soot above her working cigarette. Let's get this straight or curved. I'm not a studio creation. She took up tweezers, penciled makeup on skin so false it's true. Forgive me if I brag. I am the best lines that I've learned. All dresses drag. I'm a big fan of Mark Doty. There are many reasons for that, not least among them that he writes poems for and about dogs on occasion. So do I. Pietà. Though a twitch I took for a laugh, though still warm, just the shake and reflection of my hands. Quick barbed blood and gone. Pick up from under, but don't press the bladder. Rolled in hay, rolled in station wagon, roll into research on gurney, on guy wires. Scrawled on the calendar, it's always a beautiful day, somewhere. Worms out for blood, you out for the long count, but your eyes wink open. How many reflexes? O thou who have only loved me measurably beyond measure, have lodged thyself at my back, nudged the grasses from my mouth. I, who want it both ways, I hold the bag. Finally, I wanted to experiment with a speaker who uses the royal we. So, naturally, a queen. The song lyrics come from Fred Fisher, Billy Rose, and Irving Berlin, and you'll know them when you hear them. This is called Baltimore Did Pretty Well for a Torch Singer. We raise our lamp higher, our whole neighborhood of lamps, and sidle, darling, up to the microphone. There's music, We turn our best face to it. In college, we knew a boy who juggled torches, lit ones, on fire. He was a tenor prone to operatic moments. We called him Torch. The closest ever we came to crisis, seeing one land bright side down, stinking up the new varnish. Hand us another, would you? It's bad for the pipes, but oh, the smoke looks lovely. We'd rather be blue, living with you. We'd rather be blue over you than be happy with somebody else. Did you hear the one about the girl pirate? She put her lover on the ship of fools. He was the brightest bulb aboard, so they put him up top and used him for a fog light. To this day, you can still see him bobbing in the harbor. Well, we think it's funny. And maybe the Navy will take you on its bus and put its arms about you. But what about us? Thank you for loving our whatnot.
I'm going to sit down now because I can only talk to you. That was extraordinary. Thank you so much. Well, I want to say a word or two about Carl Dennis, who was born in Missouri, 150 miles north of me, and received his PhD from UC Berkeley. I'm just doing the highlights here. UC Berkeley in 1966. So I was commenting he knew free speech before there was a cafe here. He, I think shortly thereafter, went to teach at SUNY Buffalo, where you've been much of the rest of your career as a professor as well as a poet. Carl Dennis is recipient of the Pulitzer Prize and the Ruth Lilly Prize, most notably. I think out of these details, it might be most useful to know, to go back to that item about Buffalo. I think a lot of the atmospherics of this poem are helped to know where he's coming from and where he's getting a reprieve from at this moment. I looked up the forecast in Buffalo this evening. It's 37 degrees in Buffalo, and the chance for snow or rain are quite good. Quite so. It's that's what you're missing this evening. The thing you most need to know is that Carl Dennis is the poet who constructed these poems, and I think the poems themselves really don't need an introduction. They speak for themselves, and they speak with, if I can use your phrase, the frank speech of a friend. That's the voice they take up what seems like effortlessly here. I thought I would just say a word or two about a couple of the titles, and maybe a pronoun or two as we go. I'm going to confine myself to Carl Dennis's most recent book, which you'll find a stack over here for sale, and I hope I can interest you in reading further. I know some of you have already been reading this book, some of my students and others. I taught the last poem in this book, last interview. Callings is the name of this book, and it's an interesting title to me. One of the things that strikes me about it, and it seems just a little unsettling for a book of poetry, is that it's in the plural. That's not what we're expecting. So I looked up. I'll come back to that. I looked up calling in the singular in the dictionary, and there were two definitions in my American heritage. One was an inner urge, a strong impulse. The second was an occupation, profession, or career. And that's an interesting division, and I think many of the poems in Callings are not going to fall easily in one place or the other, but certainly I think most all of them will include both of these. Another thing I would say about Callings is that there's no poem by that name in this book. That's also odd. Usually the title of a book is also the title of a poem. Instead, we have this first poem in the book, which has the title not Calling or Callings, but Other Options. And I think you only need to think how that phrase is used. My audition went terribly, and perhaps I should be considering other options. It has that feeling to it. I'm not going to talk about that poem. I'm only going to say things about the titles, but I will say that it reminded me of a traditional type of poem, sometimes called the preamel, which you can find an example of. Maybe, Rachel, you've translated this already, Horace's first ode. And this is a long title of Callings, a long poem, not that long, poem of callings or occupations. Among them, the way it goes is, some are happy doing this, some are happy doing that. And among the occupations are the Olympic athlete, the politician, the merchant, the small farmer on the family farm, the soldier, even the hunter. And then there's the turn in the poem, as you find in others like this, may, well, as for me, and in the rather clunky Loeb translation, me, the ivy, the reward of poets' brows, links with the gods above. Me, the cool grove, and the lightly tripping bands of the nymphs and satyrs, withdraw from the vulgar throng. And even if all this doesn't happen, merely the praise of the addressee of this poem, Maecenas, is enough to put Horace's head in the stars. Now, Carl Dennis's poem will take a somewhat different tack, and so will this book. I just want to read you a few of these titles to give you a sense of the callings here. You find here a roofer, or a roofer, you might say, dancers, a realtor, drugstore, aunts, after all, they have their calling, an English teacher, and then some longer titles, letter from a senior secretary at Potomac School, instructions from Lucy in Elmira, and even a motel keeper, let me not skip that one. And then at the end, we're thinking, finally, the author is going to have the last word. We have instead a poem, Last Interview, in which the poem is cast in the second person, in the voice of the interviewer, entirely in questions, which to some degree provide their own answers, but largely they're left open to be filled in by the reader. Another title I wanted to just mention before I leave this podium to Carl Dennis is normal. The last thing you want to be, if you're a poet, is normal. That's just the dirty word for poetry. So it takes a certain kind of poet to title a poem by that name, and it captures something about Carl Dennis's poetics, and I think in a way, Dennis's sense of poetic time. You know, the strange time is the exceptional time. It's the kairos, that moment, the crux. But then there's the rest of the time, the rest of life, when one is maybe, raking leaves or going to Target. These kind of normal activities that we do that we don't, we usually edit out. We surely don't write entire poems like that, but we edit these, we tend to edit these ordinary moments out. But then, not all those strange or critical moments are good. And sometimes one visits a hospital or something, and one is very happy to find that one is, after all, normal. So it's an interesting investigation into that word, and I think I'll leave it there. Carl Dennis, thank you. Welcome.
Thanks very much, John. The initial meaning of callings is being called to a vocation. Not many of us can feel that there is one clear single call, though we do envy people who seem to be so called, though even those people have usually some conflict between accepting a call and resisting a call. And I want to begin with a poem about Leonardo, who's an example, obviously, of someone who's been called, but who also resists, in some sense, the call. Leonardo. We say we could use a voice from above to tell us how well we're doing, but if it gave us unqualified commendation, we might be skeptical. And if it ventured on stern advice about mending our ways, we might resist it covertly, if not openly, if we hadn't already come on our own to the same conclusion. Even if it urged us to lavish more of our time on whatever we most love doing, we might demur. It's hard to believe that if an angel had come in a dream to Leonardo, enjoining him to complete more paintings, he'd have decided to abridge his studies in anatomy and hydraulics, optics and metallurgy, and the origins of clouds. The issue isn't only which interest is going to prove the most productive, it's also his effort to be Leonardo, a man of many interests, not merely one. It feels presumptuous to label irrelevant his lifelong interest in birds, which led him to work near the end on the problem of human flight, to sketch ingenious devices to get us airborne. Yes, if a voice from above could speak for us, it might inform him that with time so scarce, flight ought to serve him more as a metaphor for all he can do in his painting, for soaring in spirit to an ampler perspective than the flesh can climb to on its own. But why can't the flesh and spirit, he might have asked, go soaring together for at least a moment? And we'd have to agree, a flight like that might be a pleasure to both, however galling the tie that bound them might sometimes prove after they touched down. So Leonardo is a figure of ambition, and I contrast it in the book to a character who accepts limits rather than pushes at the edges. And that's a poem that John referred to called Normal. This time around, You're a man who hears in the word normal an undertone of reproof, but next time it may sound like a blessing, as soothing a word as it is to someone who wakes between cool sheets after weeks of fever. All he wants to do is sit in his yard on a morning like this one, no fresher than a normal October morning, and watch as a squirrel no grayer than the one before you darts up the sycamore. Can you see yourself there as well, on a bench in a drift of leaves whose reds and yellows are normal for this time of year? This time around, the figure who sits there seems to suffer from a want of will, a tendency to settle for whatever's offered. Next time, he may seem a hero for taking pleasure in raking leaves into piles no higher than those his neighbors make, at a pace no faster. Plenty of time to finish before evening arrives, before a sunset that won't have to best the others to be a good one. Plenty even if Chowder keeps charging the piles and burrowing in. A good game, good frisking, good dog, good dog. Now his bark is distracting as you muse on what's left to be done if you're to exercise more of your powers by nightfall. Then it may seem to enhance the leisurely pace of the moment, the bark of a farm dog from across the pasture, reminding you that you're not required to add more acres to those you have, just to keep plowing when it's time to plow, and harvesting in harvest season, as farmers have always done. We think of calling as very often finding a traditional practice that we then choose our own and conform to. But there's also an attempt made sometimes to redefine the practice itself, to expand on it, to reinterpret it, to make it different. And the next two poems are by two different figures who take a traditional vocation and then try to redefine it. The first one is called Silent Prophet. It's the last day, but I'm keeping the news to myself. If yesterday it made sense for letter carriers to carry letters from door to door, the job still ought to be worth doing. Why tell what I know and risk a walkout? Let firefighters race to the last fire. Let platoons of police set up their last line so the factions that come to the demonstration fight only in words and gestures. The day is different, but only for me, knowing as I do there won't be others, that the world is destined to end at midnight. It's now or never for a cautious investor to resist his nature enough to back a grocery in a battered district. Now or never for the would-be grocer to open a bottle of good champagne in the kitchen of the friend who's led him through the small print maze of the application. And now, while they're toasting the months to come, scheduled to move the project along from drawing blueprints to cutting ribbons, shall I tell them their expectations are dreams? Though silent, I'm rooting for them to let the day expand to include the days to be denied them. Just as I'm rooting for the woman across the hall from the friend's apartment who's learning to play the viola from scratch. Good for her if she finds an hour today for practice despite the extra hours required at the insurance firm as tax day approaches and the usual work of tending 2 teenage sons alone. Should I sit on a stone and lament that this day is her last, when I believe it may well contain, scrolled up within it, all the years she'll need to play as she'd like to play, voicing on strings the feelings stirred by the gap between the world she planned to live in and the world available. Another prophet, one convinced that the present requires the future to give it substance, may decide to speak out. I'm keeping silent as one of her sons sits at his desk, dividing a page into reasons for leaving home and reasons for staying. It's his last chance to ask what region is the most to teach him, or what region will likely prove most in need of whatever he'll have to offer after he learns where his talents lie. So that's a person who is a prophet and who is practicing his own version of prophecy by not telling what he knows. And this next poem is a poem about someone who says more than the job actually calls for. This is called Letter from a Senior Secretary at Potomac School. I like to admit at the outset that the job we advertised in American history might have been yours if your application hadn't been misfiled, as sometimes happened under our old procedures. Under the new, I wouldn't have had to type the letter sent you last month by the principal to explain that our opening was already filled. Then you wouldn't have made your angry phone call, which I hope you'll be relieved to know I didn't mention to him. His cool tone wasn't meant to suggest indifference. It's a tone our lawyers advise to help us avoid conceding so much it leads to litigation, a problem I'm not concerned with, being only 3 months away from retirement. Here in this unofficial letter from me, which I'm asking you to keep confidential, I want to point out that wherever you end up teaching, you'll have to learn how to deal with disappointment. What will you do, say, when the textbook chosen by a committee in your new department turns out to be shallow as well as slipshod? Will you look for another job? Or will you use the occasion to show your students how to spot the issues the book's neglected and go looking elsewhere for enlightenment? If I did my job by the book, I wouldn't have stayed late at the office this afternoon to write you this. I'd have written you off as one of the self-absorbed, caught up in avenging slights to his dignity. Keep in mind I could be at home now, enjoying a taste for serious fiction and poetry passed on to me by my English teacher in high school, Harriet Henderson. But here I am, extending myself beyond the call of duty. Now it's up to you to ignore or appreciate my extra effort, just as the extra effort I hope you make may or may not impress your students. Even the best of them, remember, may not be aware how much they're learning. So you may not be aware how much these words, which now may seem addressed to someone dreamed up by me out of nothing, may later seem to be meant for you. These poems are also raising the issue of how a vocation, as you might define a vocation, relates to the community. What kind of connection is there between practicing a vocation well and helping to serve or not serve the community? So this next one is sort of a confession of failure. It's called Tribal. Tribal music is throbbing now tonight from River Records as I leave the warmth of the Hunan kitchen and make my way along snow-struck Niagara Street. A heavy drumbeat that might have prompted even the tribal elders to join the dance. It follows me, fading as I follow the smoke of my own breath, the few blocks to my car. Nobody out braving the cold tonight, unless I count the man bedded down in the dark doorway of Safeway appliances. For a moment, the inch-thick blanket of snow flung over him in his cart seems to translate him into a marble monument to an unknown refugee whose tribal village had to be abandoned. Maybe its wells dried up. Maybe it was torched by soldiers or gangs. Here he sleeps by the roadside. There he'd be cozy under his own roof with his wife and children, or lodged as a guest with a family inspired by the tribal doctrine that regards the roofless as God protected. If this night turns out as cold as predicted, a van on the prowl may cart him down to the homeless shelter. As I pass him, my wish that he wake up rested leaves nothing changed. When I reach my car, it's the work of a moment to brush the snow off and ease out into the trickle of late-night traffic with It's Only a Paper Moon on the Golden Oldies station for company. Back in the 30s, when this song was new, a man like the Sleeper might have ridden the rails with a tribe of nomads looking for work. Now he's simply someone soon to wake up to the chilly fact he lacks an address and isn't likely to find one. If better fortune finds him, it will take the form of someone enrolled in a tribe I don't belong to. Bound by a code I have no trouble admiring from a distance as suiting the gifts of its eager adherents exactly. For people like that, such kindness comes naturally, I tell myself. For me to attempt it, I'd have to pretend to be someone else. And so I want to contrast that sort of failure of action with a success in an imaginative reconstruction or creation of a community. This is called recall notice. Gone now, the young professor who took pleasure in hauling Lear before the court of a sophomore classroom and pronouncing the old king headstrong, hungry for praise, intemperate, and flagrantly ignorant of the world, confident he could cede his kingdom and still retain his kingly authority. Gone the old professor, the young one became, who taught that Lear deserves to be praised after the arrogance of Act I for shaking his fist in the face of calamity and asking what can be made of the nothing he's left with, or next to nothing. Gone the students taught the old view, whose notebooks the old professor would like to recall for some serious alterations in focus and tone. Or if not the notebooks of all, then those of the few who paid attention and remembered the class long afterward. Rebecca Bryce, for instance, who sat near the front, head bent, taking every word down, while most of the others studied the rain, soaking the hemlocks outside the window. To her, he'd have been happy to send a note expressing the hope no lecture of his berating Lear for trusting and flattery left her suspicious of friendly overtures, reluctant to let her guard down for a minute. To her, a note hoping his pious praise of Lear's belated humility and contrition didn't induce her to suffer injustice tamely. Gone from the world the belief that the two can talk about it in some other life, a life that now only imagination finds room for. There he's delighted to learn from her that his worry is more than a little ridiculous, his claim to an influence he never came close to possessing. There he has a chance to be foolish, like Lear at the end, oblivious to the issue of royal authority. And after the end, when the king chats over there with Cordelia all afternoon, the professor makes sure that the pair are not interrupted. There he goes, patrolling the perimeter of their country cottage, turning messengers from the court away. The idea of a calling actually has a religious origin. You were called by a higher power to serve in a particular way. And though I think for most of us that idea is a little too narrow and solemn and restrictive, it still has a certain kind of power, and so I wanted to do some kind of homage to that in this poem, which is called Cougar, which you'll see is a metaphor for a certain kind of big question attitude that older perspective supports. Now that the few big questions with fangs and claws that used to roam the uplands of conversation have dwindled away or been driven off, it's no surprise that the population of little questions has multiplied till the woods and meadows are threatened with overgrazing, the spring shoots chewed down to the nub, the bark stripped from the boles of the doomed saplings. One fierce question like, why are you starving your soul while you feed your flesh on dainties, could keep in check the crowd of inquiries now pressing in about filling the gap between lunch and dinner on a rainy Sunday. Do you want to watch a movie about Hawaii? Do you want to put up shelving in the garage so you'll be able to find the bag of charcoal when it's time for a backyard barbecue? No more tracks in the mud of a wolf or cougar that made a walk to the barn an adventure. No letter to be read by candlelight in the kitchen at the plank table from great uncle Obadiah, who wants to know if you're doing something at last to justify your existence, to prove, despite appearances, that the gift of life wasn't thrown away when it dropped on you. So that poem calls for some kind of pushback. So this is a poem called Ants, in which the poet tries to resist certain solemnities. These ants, busy under the picnic table where I sit tweaking my ode to summer, descend from the same tribe that Solomon holds up as an example. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, and be wise. Is he speaking to me? Is he suggesting I'm nowhere busy enough to suit him? Look who's talking as he pens a proverb while leaning back on his cushioned couch in the grassy pergola of his summer palace. It's far more likely he's addressing himself. Another morning has been frittered away in revising an invitation to the Queen of Sheba. in adjusting the syntax and diction so the sentences sound sincere, not like the usual courtly compliments. Go to the ant, he exhorts his majesty, and as he writes, he feels the crumbs of the poppy seed cake he's nibbling fall from his glossy beard to the grass, where the ants are waiting in silence. Now for the long haul to the nest. Now for packing the bulky load in the bins allotted and falling asleep in leather jerkins and work boots. To go to the ants and decree their right to be sluggards now and then when the fancy takes them, that would be an enterprise for a king. Let them sleep in tomorrow while he succeeds in drafting his invitation in an easy holiday style, informal but earnest, that Sheba needs to read only once before she orders her fleet to set sail. I think I'll read two more poems. And one is a kind of thought experiment. How close is the world that we live in if people actually did their vocations as they're supposed to be doing to the best world? It's called The Best World. Much about the edge of the park may require little improvement to be included in a scene from the best world. The people strolling here under the branches may bear a strong resemblance to strollers there as they move along in pairs, trios, or tribes past benches like these. There too, some enjoy circulating and some sitting still and looking on. On the bench facing mine, the young man and two young women seem to be talking as easily as they would on a bench in the best world. And the old man, sitting alone with the paper, is perusing the news as eagerly as anyone would over there who has interests beyond the neighborhood. And the middle-aged woman lost in a book wouldn't be out of place among those over there who believe their perspective could use some widening. Only the entrance of a raggedy man jingling a paper cup might be a reminder we're here, not there. For in the best world, everyone has enough to live on. Anyone begging there would be only pretending to be a beggar, to give others the chance to prove they were open-handed. Now the woman, laying her book aside to hunt in her purse, would be passing the test, while the young man and his two friends who don't look up would be failing, unless they had pierced the beggar's disguise and were vexed at having their kindness questioned. Here in this park, where the beggar looks genuine, the three may feel they deserve a rest from work week demands. Tomorrow it may be hard to tell their jobs from jobs in the best world, if they enjoy them as workers do over there, or as the two men I noticed an hour ago seemed to enjoy sharing a scaffold as they washed the windows of an office building across from the park. How serene they looked, as if they thought of themselves as privileged to work far above the flow of traffic. How could the best world be better for them, so long as they're pleased to witness an office with grimy windows gradually brighten? As for the people working inside, it's hard to say if they're as grateful for their lighter spirits as their counterparts would be in the best world. Maybe some are, while others assume they've only the wind to thank, the careless wind that's happened to nudge a cloud away. So the last poem is a poem called Last Interview, in which it's a poem about the ultimate interview, in which you were asked the ultimate questions by the ultimate interviewer. Would you say, looking back, that one moment proved defining, breaking your life into before and after, a dark age followed by an enlightenment? Or has your development been more gradual, a slow-growing commitment, say, to ferry the light of truth as it dawned for you into darkness, now making headway against contrary currents, now falling back? Did you find the work lonely, or did you glimpse a flicker answering yours and steer in its direction through lingering mist? Was the meeting a joyful one? Did it end with a shared promise to keep in touch? Would you say the thought of the good you were doing in teaching, for instance, a class in prison made the long drive easy? Or did you need some help from the scenery, from a question like whether an old church by a filling station was beautiful still, despite the wound dealt to its symmetry by the new brick annex? Were you ever forced to pull off the road when you suddenly realized that your feelings for a woman you considered simply a friend had a will of their own and an agenda? Did you yield to their entreaties or resist them to save your strength for ventures to come? As for the trips you planned to take but didn't, do you blame bad luck when blaming feels essential, or a change of heart? Have you fought fire with fire, a destructive passion like spite with a creative one like indignation? Or have you tried to immerse all flame in a deep pool of quiet and emerge serene? With a sheaf of blessings you bound yourself. Have you blessings left to scatter on likely soil? On the whitewashed wall above your desk, do the figures depicted in the reproduction look as if they will live forever, or as if they will die one day and know it? Can you tell us about the day you understood that the tree destined to shade your grave was already tall, that the shovel handle was already fitted into the steel socket? Did the resolutions you made then suffer more when they proved unworkable from a want of will or a want of focus? Do you think your focus would have been more clear if you'd asked yourself what we're asking now? Thank you.